So I'm John. I introduced myself earlier, but for the sake of the stream and the recording, I'm the Developer Engagement Manager at Zeit. I'm a web scraping professional, and I also have a YouTube channel on which I create and share videos that I find interesting based on this topic. So I'm going to finish the day off today with a little bit of a story about a few things that I found difficult and how I overcame them as a solo developer learning and implementing web scraping in a business and as a freelancer at the same time. So I've called it web scraping is easy, right? Because at one point it was pretty easy, and I think a lot of people might, maybe not after today's talks when we had some great technical information, might have said, well, it still kind of is. So for me, the value prospect that I had as a solo developer when I was working in a company, the thing that I prided myself on the most was being able to build all my scrapers myself. And I think a lot of developers in this room will think the same way. Your value is tied to your ability to actually extract the information from the site and hand it up the chain or pass it on to whoever. In my case, I was passing it up for analysis in the company that I was working for, and I eventually started doing this for solos as well. And what I liked about this is that I had full control. So everything that I used was essentially, apart from a few minor external services, was built by me. So I built all the spiders for myself. I managed my own infrastructure. I made sure that if I needed any external services, like I built a fairly rudimentary but workable proxy system that meant I could test and retry. And I even had a go at browser infrastructure. Never again on that, no thank you. So I thought that this was where I was at, this is what I was doing. But then as time progressed, as we all know, our favorite word, AI, things started to change, and I noticed that everything became much harder. And I think Fabienne said it as well, the cost to entry is growing, and it's became much more difficult. With AI-driven anti-bot systems, advanced fingerprinting techniques, all the new capture, it's unpleasant. And the rising infrastructure and maintenance costs, and this was kind of the main one for me. Having built all my own services, as I said at the start, keeping those going was becoming quite difficult. So my main point for this is, for me, how did I succeed in this, is that I offloaded it. I stopped doing it myself. And that's the core message that I've got. And I'm going to be honest, it took me a little bit of time to swallow my own pride and be like, okay, this is fine. I don't have to be the person that does everything. I don't have to manage it all myself. My value is not dictated by how good my code is. And I'll come back to that in just a second. Now I've put here for everything. And I'll come back to that as well, but this is a key point for me because I know that a lot of people use services based on what their requirements are and how it's going to work for them. And I totally understand that. Businesses have different requirements. But for me, for everything meant a lot more consolidation, and that was very important. So argument one for this, which I went through all this myself mentally before I sort of committed to moving everything over, was IP bands and proxies. We've talked a lot about this today. Very challenging thing that has to be managed. It's not as simple as just getting a couple of IPs and going for it. It doesn't work like that anymore with the fingerprinting. If your fingerprint gets flagged and matched, you can have as many IPs as you like, and you're still not going to get anywhere. Capture management, really didn't like this. It was awful. Browser management, hated that even more. But infrastructure scaling. So all of these things are very manageable at a small scale. But I found as my skills developed, as the business that I was working for wanted more and more data from more and more sites, and as I started to take on my own clients, building things out, helping people, I found that as I scaled up, it became even more difficult and even more impossible. And I think this is a very common problem that I think everybody in this room will appreciate. So I looked at to try and reclaim some of my time. So I've put out some rough kind of numbers here, which is kind of, I think, was my breaking point, where I would spend about 70% of my allotted time that I had to web scraping in my job. I had other things that I had to do as well, was spent maintaining what I'd already built, rather than making new things and extracting new data to help the business and my clients. Those 3 a.m. calls, that's never nice when you wake up and something that you're supposed to be relying on has stopped working, and you have to spend time fixing it instead of watching Good Morning on the TV. I was ending up fighting fires more than I was actually building anything. And I wanted to shift the focus away from my maintenance to my actual new value proposition, which I figured. So I moved it over, and I kind of roughly estimated that after I moved, I spent about 10% of my time on maintenance. Because I was using Web Scraping API, the worst thing that happened stopped working. I had to raise a support ticket and chase it, which is a lot easier than trying to figure out why your browser stack stopped working. My third argument and third thing that I wanted to talk about that I really had to go through, and this was possibly the hardest one to understand, is that in the end of the day, the people that I was delivering data to did not care how good my scraping skills were, or how good my spiders were, or how amazing my browser infrastructure wasn't, but they thought it was. What they cared about was getting data that they needed reliably, consistently, and on time. So for me, this became my main focus. I wanted to be able to take more clients, and I wanted the business that I was working for, that I was invested in, to be able to work better and prosper, and we needed data. So I shifted it over, and I thought, let's focus on what matters. Let's get that information from our competitor sites in this case, and make sure that we have all the knowledge available to move the business forward using the data. Now, with a web scraping API, there are obvious trade-offs. And how you fit into this depends on your own business and how you work. Now, I know a lot of people use it for some things and not other things. And as I said earlier, I moved over to using it for everything. So the obvious one is the extra cost. Now, for me, this wasn't a massive issue when I actually sat down and thought about it. And I think a lot of you that maybe have been through this as well, we have to factor in the time we spend fixing things that we've already written, the time that we spend maintaining services that we've already built, versus the data cost versus the actual moving over to a cost per request basis. What I did find in the end was, for me personally, in my situation, it wasn't that different. The amount of time that I spent not fixing things was saved in the cost here. But what it also meant was I found it much easier to quote for projects, because I knew pretty much ahead of time X amount of requests on this site is going to cost me roughly this. So I had to figure out what I was working on and do that way. And I found it much more just easier to manage in that way for that. Loss of control is another one which I found very difficult. And I think a lot of developers find the same. But for me, it wasn't a total loss of control, because the way I wanted to do it is I was still writing my own code. I was still writing my own spiders. I was still in control of how and when I ran them. I ended up moving that across to a provider as well, but that was for other reasons. I wasn't looking, and nothing was going into this mysterious black box. It was all running through my code. I had error messages that I could debug and see what were coming through, and I could understand what was actually happening. The third one was the edge cases. I touched a little bit on this earlier, and I included this not because I think it didn't hit me too much, but I know that it exists, is that sometimes you just have to do some weird and wonderful things on a website to get where you want it to be. All sorts of running JavaScript and all of that sort of stuff, which becomes a little bit more difficult when you're using a managed service. So these edge cases are something that needs to be considered. But even with a hybrid approach here, I've got 90-10. For me, it was probably actually more like 95-5. So the conclusion that I came to is the choice was clear for me, which was get more clients, provide a better service, and migrating to a web scraping API was the absolute total solution for me, and it was just an absolute no-brainer. So I've rattled through this quite quickly because I know this is all anecdotal and this is all my story, and it's, I'm hoping that it kind of resonates a little bit with you, but also because we've had so many great talks today that we've covered so much stuff, and I want to jump in quickly before Suzanne says, I just want to say, as the speakers know, that I helped organize speaking here and organized all that, and so I really appreciate it all coming out, and I really appreciate the speakers for giving up their time and sharing their knowledge with us, and it's been fascinating. So I'm going to call it there, and I'm going to let us all finish up and move on to the bar.